It's a great opportunity for me to be able to introduce the Honourable Pamela Wallin. So I'm really excited to hear you share. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today, and um, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, first, yeah, I have to add my very first job out of university was at the Prince Albert Penitentiary. So you should know that too, because that was in my social work days. It's been quite a kind of a span. It's really great. I want to thank you, Colin, because he first extended this invitation to come and speak with you today, even though it's not in person. But this was way pre-COVID when we ran into each other on a plane or somewhere, I can't remember. And that seems like a lifetime ago. So thank you for that invitation. I want to thank Ed File too for making this happen. It took dozens of emails and Zoom and time changes and time zones and all the rest. So much appreciated. There are, of course, as we well know, many more difficult things in life than taming of all this technology and COVID. Things such as understanding where the money will come from for all the budget plans, or figuring out how climate change is going to impact the energy sector and vice versa, or whether Meghan and Harry can really afford their own security. But seriously, that we are here and still standing and doing all of this really does mean we are a resilient lot, because when faced with a problem, we look for a solution that not only solves that issue, but we turn that into an opportunity to solve other existing problems. So perhaps going forward, you'll figure out that your meeting should be held virtually, and it certainly makes it easier for those of us today sitting in Ottawa to participate. So it is going to change our world. You know the old saying that the oak fought the wind and was broken, and the willow bent when it had to, and it survived. So I think that's the first step for all of us in becoming more resilient, in accepting this new reality that we're in. We need to bend a little like the willow, because that's going to make it easier to function and cope. Resilience is the ability, of course, to withstand crisis, but that does not mean that people won't experience the stress or the emotional upheaval that comes with crisis. Some think about resilience as mental toughness, and it is, but actually it's also demonstrated through working through that emotional upheaval and stress, and these days even fear, no matter whether that's irrational or real. So I think we all agree that resilience in business or even in personal terms also means remaining productive when faced with that stress and uncertainty and change. It's also going to require a bit of a thick skin, because people don't generally like change or disruption, and it will require persistence to get ourselves through it. And with all the frustration and short tempers that we've all been dealing with, perhaps the most important skill these days is the ability to say, I was wrong, or thank you, you were right on that one. And this is always a tough task, particularly for the boss in any situation. But as any good leader knows, failure is also a powerful teacher. We learn from lessons hard earned. The late media mogul Izzy Asper once remarked that if at first you don't succeed, welcome to the club. And I'm sure there are many of you who can identify with that. I certainly can, having chosen to be an entrepreneur in the media world when it was really still just a duopoly. But it was a good experience, and we all learned from it, and we changed the landscape a bit. I read an interesting definition of leadership, and it was years ago, but it has always stuck with me because it's so simple. A good manager does the thing right. A leader does the right thing. This is what we ask of those in charge, whatever the business, whatever the circumstance. Use their judgment to not only do the thing right, but to do the right thing. These are trying times, and the fiscal and social pressures on business leaders are unprecedented. It's hard to always do the right thing or even know what that is, given the fluid nature of what is acceptable or possible these days. Pandemics, recessions, a new woke cultural context, unprecedented spending and debt levels, public anxiety. It makes just navigating the average day a real challenge. And there are endless and growing demands on business, demands for philanthropy to fill the void that governments once filled, and pressure to be greener and more sustainable in operations and products, and to embrace diversity, all the while dealing with the unprecedented public scrutiny that comes with Twitter, 24/7 news, and an activist climate. And you were talking about that in one of your earlier sessions, the role of social media and the impact it can have, not only on your business, but on your psyche. So we have to be really aware of that. Leadership, of course, requires a comfort level with risk, a comfort level with uncomfortableness. And COVID has indeed put us to that test. Shortages of vaccine, little domestic capacity to meet our own needs, and the politicization of the pandemic means that all of our decisions are fraught with the overlay of fear or denial, but mostly a sense of lack of control. What can we do in our own workplaces if governments don't buy or deliver the vaccine, or if they impose rules that at best seem contradictory, sometimes worse? So let's take a step back and think about some strategies that we all can use to deal with our new reality. First, just step up. Make a call about how you intend to lead through this and get through this. Nelson Mandela once said, "There is no passion to be found in playing small, in settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living." I love that idea because playing small doesn't serve you, and it doesn't serve the greater good, either of your business or of your community. Most of us, I suspect, are hampered by fear of our own limitations or by a lack of confidence. And the words of Adlai Stevenson, a one-time presidential nominee, he said, "It's hard to lead a cavalry if you think you look funny on a horse." And that's really true. But true leaders in business or in any endeavor don't really concern themselves with how they look on a horse. They just keep riding and moving forward and clearing the hurdles and dodging the obstacles and gaining the experience, most importantly, for the next run. This is how leaders emerge, sometimes surprising themselves. A crisis calls up out of you the strength to deal, a strength you may not even know that you possessed until circumstances demanded. I've had the opportunity to see leadership up close in business, in politics, and in the military, and through literally thousands of conversations and interviews I've conducted in my television and podcast work. As Colin said, I've served on corporate boards. I was in New York as the consul general in the months and years after 9/11 and watched Rudy Giuliani and President Bush and literally thousands of ordinary Americans respond to the needs of their fellow citizens, showing both compassion and leadership. As the honorary colonel of the Royal Canadian Air Force and the chair of the Defense Committee, we traveled to Afghanistan on several occasions when our troops were in harm's way. And this has given me a vantage point from which to observe leadership, best expressed by General Norman Schwarzkopf, who commanded US forces in Iraq. Leadership, he said, is a combination of strategy and character. If you must be without one, be without the strategy. A very, very powerful comment from a military leader. Or there was General David Petraeus, who was commander of NATO operations in Afghanistan. And he tells the story of walking through a very tough neighborhood in Baghdad. And he comes across an American command post that has a makeshift plywood door on which the following sign was posted: "In the absence of orders or guidance, figure out what they should have been and execute vigorously." Now that's another great message and another great sign. It's powerful because what it really means is that responsibility for leadership falls to us all in every circumstance, regardless of our rank or title, often without direction or experience. We just have to step up. Of course, leaders in whatever field must also earn the respect of those they serve and never assume it will flow by virtue of that title or some sense of self-importance. The latter never works. And you earn respect by knowing what you want and need to do and convincing others to come along for the ride. The first act of all persuasion is clarity of purpose. Leaders must always be clear and honest about intent and purpose and how and why you need to do what you do. You see, the truth is, if you can't offer people a vision of what they should do, you won't be able to persuade them about the things they shouldn't do. And what could be more important in your industry? So the key to successful leadership is influence, not authority. So be aware of your organization's key influencers inside and out. Seek out those who are on board with the change and have influence and can help you achieve your goals or move forward. And see resistance to that change or that plan as an opportunity to learn and maybe even better your proposals or ideas or your implementation plan. It's just a natural response to change, and understanding where opposition is rooted, where it actually comes from, can help you accomplish your goals. When thinking about leadership, two very different experiences come to mind. Many years back, I had the privilege, as I noted and Colin did, the privilege of serving on the independent panel on Canada's role in Afghanistan. This group of 5 Canadians was tasked to assess what our country's participation should look like and whether we were having the desired impact on that country, both militarily and with our aid and humanitarian contributions. We traveled across Afghanistan on several different occasions. We met with the president, with local governors, tribal council leaders, war widows, teachers, our soldiers, and theirs. And there we were one day sitting cross-legged in the desert, sipping hot sweet tea with grizzled, war-weary local leaders. And these very same principles of how to do the thing right and how to do the right thing were being discussed and debated, although obviously not using those kinds of Western buzzwords. There were some stark lessons for us as we listened, and as they gently suggested that perhaps our vision, our way of doing things, our concern with the rule of law and our rights and our democratic freedoms and our consumer choices, or our experience with government bureaucracy, or that very Western idea that lobbying leads to change, well, it was all just a little premature for the time and the place that we were in. They offered a polite thank you, but made it clear that in the short run, clean water, food, and surviving the next Taliban attack had a much higher priority than our often arrogant Western approaches. And in fact, by importing Canadian or Western ideas and expectations, we had made it very difficult to do the very job we set out to do. At the time, because of the sponsorship scandal in Ottawa, Canada required strict auditing of our aid dollars. But the new rules that made obvious sense in Canada were truly problematic in the field. And all of our well-intentioned generosity was almost impossible to deliver. We had a program where we were going to give, and I'm talking about Canada here, we were going to give chickens to war widows, young women who had lost their husbands in the war and whose mothers-in-law then moved in with them instantly. And they were to feed their children with the eggs that the chickens lay. But because Afghans are very entrepreneurial people, the women who had extra eggs went out and set up a little stand, and then they sold the eggs to other people who didn't have chickens, and they were making money and they were feeding their families. And it was a brilliant plan. But of course, as a country, we couldn't subject that to the same kinds of auditing standards that we now required at home. So we ended up giving most of the money to a third party, an NGO or the UN, to distribute, because we could audit that transaction, but not the transactions that were actually putting money or food or healthcare directly in the hands of those in need, those we were supposedly trying to help. So lesson learned. In the process of seeking to control this situation, we actually lost control and risked losing the impact that we could have had on hearts and minds not to mention the stomachs of those in need. So the laws of unintended consequences. These things are always complicated further by political imperatives, because if governments can't be seen to give the money, then governments can't get the political credit. So that also then becomes a problem and starts to limit the amount of aid and help we might want to offer when you can't get it directly because of the rules we imposed on ourselves, that the auditing process changed the very delivery process. So it makes you think about who was thinking through the impact of this. We've seen this through the COVID situation and in the budget. No new money in health transfers to the provinces who've been nearly bankrupted by COVID, but instead offering the promise of childcare, which is a 50-50 cost-shared program with the provinces. Ottawa knows the provinces can't afford that now, but it will get the credit for offering a program that will be a long time coming, and perhaps never into rural areas in places like home in Saskatchewan, where parents could probably use the money more wisely and hire the neighbor lady to do the childcare. But I digress, so I will return to the law of unintended consequences. It's often the result of the inevitable rush to regulate, a new rule for every one-off problem. And it's too often fueled by the myth that perfection is possible if you simply have enough rules. We regularly witness the hasty birth of legislation in response to a crisis, flawed relief programs that end up putting money in the wrong hands in the haste to do the right thing, defunding the police in the wake of George Floyd, rather than awaiting the verdict and sorting out what works best on the ground and in different locales, or killing pipelines that move products that we still very much need, as we are only in the very early stages of the transition to replacement energy sources. And if you have a long enough memory, you will recall the passage stateside of something called Sarbanes-Oxley in the wake of the Enron scandal, accounting firm scandal. Thousands lost money or jobs through no fault of their own, and it literally shook Wall Street to the core. But the response, the supposed cure, turned out to be worse than the disease. As one CEO wrote at the time, the practices that brought about the new rules were so egregious that something certainly had to be done. And while many elements of the rules will prove to be the right thing, others will simply be costly, counterproductive, bureaucratic exercises, and only time will be the judge of the ratio. Well, time was the judge. The legislation was established supposedly to protect business, the market, and of course the investor, yet it led to delistings and deregisterings, privatizations, accounting and compliance and audit costs skyrocketed and were punitive, crippling smaller firms who could not pay the costs and larger firms who had to add entire sections. Thousands of small entrepreneurial businesses, for sure, and in this country as well, were literally bankrupted by the reporting requirements imposed by the new law. No law or legislation can stop a premeditated criminal mind or a deliberate act of greed or theft or even Mother Nature. Rules are just too often designed to legislate morality when in fact the issue is immoral behavior. And the question always remains whether punishing that has any deterrent effect at all. Governments, and sometimes business operations too, are hostage to their own bureaucracies. Too often, those bureaucracies or systems present old solutions to new problems. We all know the Goldilocks rule that comes forward in every budget process that we've just been through in Ottawa, where the bureaucracy comes forward with an idea they like. So they propose three: one's too hot, one's too cold, and then one's just right. And these things end up in budgets. So we've always got to guard against that kind of process in your businesses when you're faced with a problem. And the lessons every day these days are ever more about the pressing need for some big picture thinking, even if your industry or job is very local focused, or even if the task is very small or focused itself. You need to understand the context in which you are leading and operating and making decisions. Is an election imminent? What's that going to mean? Will the Bank of Canada keep interest rates low? And if so, for how long? You might want to be paying attention to relevant legal precedents on liability because it may come back very specifically into your industry. Watch for how public mindsets change as they have dramatically on China, for example, since COVID and the kidnapping of the two Michaels. So if China is a customer or supplier, be ready for some backlash. Or the pandemic, when you read the reports of the Auditor General or some news organization on what appears to be almost willful blindness in the early days of COVID and the subsequent vaccine rollouts. It begs the need for accountability because despite all the warnings from the Bill Gateses and the science world and our own experience with SARS and H1N1, we shut down vaccine production facilities. We sent tons of PPE to our garbage dump and decided not to replace it. And we asked scientists to manage the crisis, and we rejected the help of industry and groups such as emergency measures operations, who would have been extremely helpful and experienced on the ground in community management. And when it came to restricting movement or vaccine rollout or even enforcing mask mandates in the public, these are folks that deal with these issues all the time. So the long and short of it is you are usually the one left figuring out what is doable, what is best for your clients and employees in your community, and whether or not your doors have to close given the context, these big picture issues that are all around you. So I am hoping that, because it would be helpful for all of us if we came out of this pandemic with a proper assessment so that we could discern some best practices, because I think we could take from that how we all might respond in future incidents, we hope not quite as grand as this. These days, you also need a tolerance for disagreement. People are increasingly only consuming information that they already know or agree with. The ratings attest to this. We see it in the US most drastically with the Fox Nation over here and the MSNBC, CNN Nation over here. Two very different worlds. It happens here, but to a slightly less dramatic effect. But these are two worldviews supported by alternate facts, but they are facts, and these are real issues in the workplaces of today. And you have to find ways to allow those discussions to occur and also to moderate or limit them. And that's a very, very touchy area, but it's very, very real these days. So in these unusual times, but anytime really, we all know that leaders go out of their way, good leaders, outstanding leaders go out of their way to boost the self-esteem of their personnel, of the people who work with them. Because if people can believe in themselves, then it's amazing what they can and what they will accomplish for themselves and for you. That's Sam Walton's theory. That's how he made Walmart a powerhouse. So how do you do that? You do that by listening and then leading, because listening, when truly done, not just waiting for the other guy to stop and so that you can say your bit, but truly listening is the ability to be changed by the other. And that is a very fundamental and powerful lesson for any leader. But of all life's lessons, the most important came from my parents, and they imparted these words of wisdom through deeds, not lectures. We watched this happen. Our character is what we do when we think no one is looking. And remember, these days, someone is always looking. So be aware of that. And the most important thing, character always trumps genius. You can be the smartest person in the room, but if you are not kind, if you are not decent, if you are not fair and generous when it's difficult to do so, then all the brains in the world are for naught. That advice has served me well in journalism, in business, yes, even in the Senate. Thank you all very much for your time today and for the invitation to be with you. Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Senator. I made lots of notes here, and I think Ed, as we recorded this, I think this will be a great share for later. So I so much appreciate you doing that. Particularly as we're talking about safety leadership, and it does require learning and applying what we've learned, particularly in this environment. We've got lots to learn. about supporting our workplaces, and with particularly with what's become an invisible hazard to us, but clearly has had very visible effect on our workplaces, our communities, and our families here at home. So again, I so much appreciate you taking the time. I'm glad that we can make this work in this virtual format
I
for you
know,
to
it's a miracle.
hear.
There's Ed.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Good person, Ed. Thank you.
So thank you so much, and Ed, thank you so much for pulling this together, because I know it was a lot of emails to coordinate. And Kelly, I will hand things back to you to close off the morning.